Okay then, the starter to this lesson. The dingbat, the puzzle, the answer is deep blue sea. And also the opportunity here for anyone who doesn't want to engage in that particular task is to do the dedicated improvement and reflection time. Okay, so the lesson is about art in the 20th century, using several images to represent each decade of the 20th century, to have the students carry out the skills of comprehension and inference in order to interpret the events of that decade by interpreting the mood, the content, the nature of the art that they are looking at. So our objectives and our outcomes and our pelts. Okay. As an introduction to the 20th century, I've identified a series of pictures and images that typify or sum up the events of a particular decade. Your task is to study each picture and evaluate it to try and sum up the artist's impression of that decade and to try and speculate as to what happened in that decade. So there's also going to be the opportunity for students to fall back on their prior learning, their general knowledge and their wider understanding of the 20th century. So as we go through this, each decade will have its image. The information for all of these pictures is contained on the separate document that's with this particular lesson. So we go through the first one as an example, 1900 to 1909, and we have our first picture. So the students are to look at the picture, to say what they see, and to make their inferences, and then to go one step further and interpret what the decade would have been like. So for example, it's all men. It's male dominated, a patriarchy, sorry. Women are only represented as statues. Maybe women are seen as adornments, but not as equals. It looks prosperous. It looks middle class. The men look content, the men look happy. So moving on, writing frame. How to actually write down and communicate what's understanding. Well, we want to know about comprehension and inference. So we have the comprehension here and we have the inference elements to follow it up. So we go from basic to higher order interpretations. Now this writing frame moves on and can be accessed at each stage during this particular. So here's some exemplar work for how the students can put their interpretations down. So what we've got is a simple paragraph response. So we're clearly looking at the skills of comprehension and inference and that extended writing that fits the GCSE style that's required now. Okay, so the formatting is all here, following the writing frame with additional colour coding for them to identify within that paragraph where they are actually doing the skill of comprehension and inference. And as I said, you can come back to that particular slide out. So once we've done the one run through on the initial picture, we can move on to the second decade. Now again, looking at the dates here, it's quite possible that you may now have some students who can predict what's going to come. What would be the image or the topic of that particular decade? If they think they know what that topic might be, how might it be represented? On a picture here about World War I, again the information provided. The more they look, the more they will see. A good picture for suggesting maybe what the student does is imagine they are stepping into the picture. What would they hear, what would they see, what would they smell? And obviously what you're seeing is a painting here of the trenches in World War I. The more you look, the more people you will see. Some are living, some are dead. They merge in with their landscape. They're like animals. But the darkness of the war is towards the top left-hand corner, being replaced by the bright light of peace. So again, a speculative question might well be, when in the decade was this one actually produced? And obviously this is towards 1918. What is the mood of the picture? How does the artist achieve it? Again, bottom right-hand corner, linking back to the writing frame at this stage. Moving on, the 1920s. The interpretation here, again, they can predict. Now, brighter students then start to compare and contrast. How do these pictures link together? It is possible that the men in the first picture fought and died in the second picture. Their children in the third picture? what is going on here, why is it happening. So this is a painting by Otto Dix, a Berlin nightclub, and again, interesting, the bright, sickly colours, and yet the distance in the eyes of the people in the picture. Partying to forget, maybe. Damaged psychologically. And interesting, women at the centre of this picture. Why might that be? Is that a consequence of the war that came? Moving on. This time the option of moving to is here. I think this is the last time it's there. That obviously you can include that and add more to it. The build up to World War II, the dark horizons are all metaphorical. Prosperous people, but blank people, anonymous to you, their backs turned to you. A very oppressive picture, a very ominous picture. The storm clouds of war approaching rapidly over the horizon. The 40s, a Henry Moore engraving. And the 50s, again, always coming after these wars. It's interesting to see if you can speculate how the pictures are connected. And into the 60s, Andy Warhol and psychedelic, the emergence of the media, Marilyn Monroe. And into the 70s, when everything calms down. And into the 80s, end of the Cold War. In this case, a photograph. All these pictures comprehend, infer, tone, emotion. Step into the picture. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What does it tell you about the decade? And finally, the speed of media and communication, the growth of the internet, mobile phones and technology, everything moving at a blur. Each of the decades in turn. So then, maybe homework, maybe an extension task. So what image would sum up the first decade of the 21st century, or the second decade of the 21st century? One picture, one painting, one image. And then finally, to review the lesson in its entirety.